early class. So this is how I am defining the eye level diagram. So first is object class, and the throwable class is child class of the object class, right? Under throwable classes, there are two subclasses which we have seen already. One is what exception class. Second one is we have another class in the name of error, right? Under exception class, there are four major subclasses. One is runtime exception class, right? After this, we have what IO exception, and after this, we have interrupted exception. Right? And we have remote exception. There are so many exception classes that are available under exception class, but these four exceptions are commonly occurred exceptions in the real time. So we will discuss only about the common exceptions, right? Not exception. Right? So under runtime exception, we have many classes, many subclasses. So let us say that we have arithmetic exception. Secondly, we have null pointer exception. Thirdly, we can say index out of bound exception. And we have illegal argument exception. And yeah, these are the main exception class that is available under the runtime exception class. So under index out of bound exception, and again it has two subclasses, which is string index out of bound, array index out of bound. Right. So these are the subclasses of runtime exception class. So arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, index out of bound, illegal argument exception. And under index out of bound, we have two subclasses: string index out of bound, array index out of bound. Okay. So and again under IO exceptions, let us take two examples, two subclasses under IO exception. One is EOF exception. EOF exception is nothing but end of the file exception. Second one is file not found exception. Right. If I draw an eye level diagram, this is how the eye level diagram will look like. Right. So throwable, under throwable, we have exception class and we have error class. So under exception class, we have four subclasses. One is runtime exception, second one is IO exception, third is interrupt exception, and fourth is remote exception. If you ask me only four exceptions are available, no, there are many number of exceptions that are available, but these are the most commonly occurred exceptions in the real-time application. So we need to, if we understand these exceptions, then understanding the remaining exceptions is going to be easy, right? So, and again under runtime exception, we have these many exceptions under runtime. One is arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, index out of bound exception, illegal argument exception. And specifically under index out of bound exception, we have two subclasses. First one is string index out of bound, which is separate class, and array index out of bound. Okay. Under IO exception, if you want me to write the high level diagram, there exception, this is how it is. So under IO exception, EOF is the part of IO exception, and file not found is the part of IO exception, input output exception. So my question is, what are the checked and unchecked exception in this exception hierarchy? So if you ask me about what are the checked exceptions, first let's talk about unchecked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions are nothing but the exceptions that are not even checked by the compiler. The exception, both the checked and unchecked exception, they both occur in the runtime. They both will happen in the runtime, but one will be checked in the compile time. Which one will be checked in the compile time? Checked exceptions are the one that will be checked in the compile time. What will be checked? If the developer is writing any handling code or not, that will be checked. If there is no handling code, compiler will not be happy, and the code will not be compiled successfully. So we need to make sure that an handling code is defined in the checked exceptions. We have seen these things in the previous classes, previous sessions, right? So if you ask me what are checked exceptions or unchecked exceptions in this under this hierarchy, exception hierarchy, all the runtime exceptions are unchecked. All the exceptions under the runtime, including the runtime exception, all the exceptions that is falling under the runtime exception class, all these exceptions, I mean don't include IO exception, all these exceptions, runtime exceptions, they are called unchecked exceptions. They are strictly unchecked. All these exceptions are strictly unchecked exceptions. Okay? And the remaining exceptions are checked exceptions. Right? Remaining exceptions, we have what? We have IO exception, interrupt exception, remote exception, and under IO we have these many exceptions. And apart from this, there are so many exceptions that I have not categorized here, right? But still, if you talk about unchecked exception, only runtime exceptions are unchecked. Right? Apart from runtime, all the exceptions are checked exceptions. Right? This is the simple. If anyone is asking you, can you give me any two examples of unchecked exceptions? You can obviously give runtime exception. Right? You can give arithmetic exception as one example and null pointer exception as one example. You can give arithmetic or index out of bound exception. Right? If anyone is asking you, give some examples about checked exceptions. You can say IO exception. File not found exception is a checked exception. Right? So I think checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions, we have found the answer, right? And this is just a theory, and we have already discussed about things, how the internally how it is getting executed and how the exceptions are getting popped out. We have seen those things in the last sessions. So this is the generalized theory that anyone can ask and anyone should keep in mind. What are list out some checked exceptions means you have to list out some checked exceptions. If you are asked to list out some unchecked exceptions means you should be in a position to list out the unchecked exceptions. And if you ask me what is partially checked and what is fully checked, this is also an interview question. What is partially checked and what is fully checked exception? Right? If you find any class, for example, so forget about this error. Forget about this error because errors are not exceptions, right? So we do not consider this. When you talk about checked and unchecked exception, you will consider, you will exclude this error thing. You will exclude this error class. This will be excluded, right? We'll talk about the exception. You talk about only the exception class, right? Because under the exception class, the exceptions are categorized into checked and unchecked, right? So this is unchecked and remaining exceptions are checked exceptions. Right? And if we are specifically asked which are the partially checked exception and which are the fully checked exceptions, if the question is categorized like this or if the question is drafted like this, right? If you see, if you take exception, just imagine that, for example, let us consider this exception class. You take this exception class, right? You cannot say that exception class is the fully checked exception class. What does it mean exactly? For example, let us say that You are visiting a mall with your family, any mall, or you are visiting like any big shopping mall, right? After purchasing things, you will be obviously you will be frisked and your family members will be frisked. Frisked in the sense you will be checked by the security guards. It doesn't mean that security guard is going to do the full checking. If you are carrying or if you are holding your just assume that you are married, and if you have some children, the security guard is not going to check the children, right? So those are the special cases. He will just do the partial check, right? But what if you visit the airport? Airport is the place where the security is given the top priority. So nothing can be compromised. Even the child, the same treatment the child gets, the same treatment is, I mean that's the adult, the treatment that adult is going to get is the same treatment the child is also going to get in the airport. Even the child will be frisked as well as the adults they will also be frisked. They will not take anything for granted. So they do the full checking. But in the shopping malls, they don't do the full checking. They show some partiality. So let it be. They don't mind about. They don't mind to check the kids or to check the children. Likewise, to talk about exception class here, under the exception class, it has checked exception as well as some unchecked exceptions. This is one unchecked exception. This runtime exception is a, let me take this in different color. Runtime exception is an unchecked exception. But apart from runtime exceptions, remaining exceptions are what? Remaining exceptions are checked exceptions. So if you talk about exception class has many subclasses. So some subclasses are categorized as unchecked, and some subclasses are categorized as checked exception, right? So the exception class will fall under the category what? It is not those subclasses or something which is not completely checked exception, because one of the exception is unchecked exception. That's why exception class will come under the category of what? Partially checked exception. Partially checked exception. Because it's if you talk about the subclasses, the subclasses has both checked exception as well as unchecked exception, right? It is not completely checked or completely unchecked, right? That's why exception class is called partially checked. And if you talk about throwable has again two subclasses. One is exception and error. Forget about this error. And again exception. The exception is again further categorized into many exceptions. Under this, it has again checked exception, unchecked exception, and again some checked exceptions. Because throwable class has some child classes which is not completely checked as well as which is not completely unchecked. It has both the combination of checked as well as unchecked. That's why throwable class is also called as partially checked exception. Partially checked exception. Okay, then what is fully checked exception? If anyone is asking you about what are the classes that is called as fully checked exception. So this IO, input output exception, interrupted exceptions, remote exception. If you check its subclasses, all the subclasses are completely checked. They are checked. There are no subclasses that is existing under this particular exceptions, which is a unchecked exception. Hope you will understand. You just consider this IO exception, interrupt exception, remote exception. All the exception classes and all the subclasses are completely checked exceptions. Okay, that's why they are called as these classes are called as what? Fully checked exceptions. Let me write it here. Okay. If anyone is asking about partially checked exceptions, there are only two partially checked exceptions in Java exception hierarchy. First one is throwable. Second one is exception class. Throwable class. Second one is what? Exception class. So these two exceptions are what? Partially checked exceptions. This is one takeaway. And second takeaway, apart from these two exceptions, all the other exception classes are called fully checked exceptions, except runtime exception. So if we talk about runtime exception, so there is only one unchecked exception class in Java, which is runtime exception class. All the runtime exception, all the classes that is falling under the runtime exceptions are unchecked exceptions. This is another takeaway. Runtime exception. Partially checked means throwable class, exception class. Unchecked exception means only one exception, which is runtime exception and its subclasses. And what about fully checked exception? So fully checked exception. Apart from these two, apart from throwable and exception class, and excluding this error, because error is not considered as an exception, right? Apart from these two, IO exception, interrupted exception, or remote exceptions, these things are called as what? Fully checked exception. You can give these examples. IO exception, interrupted exception, remote exception, and so on. Fully checked, except in Java only two exceptions are there that are partially checked. Which one is throwable and second one is exception. Apart from these two, all the other exceptions, excluding runtime exception, are fully checked exceptions. Because here we are talking especially about checked exception, right? In that case, these two are the exceptions that will come under the fully checked exception. These are the examples. Right? Unchecked exceptions, partially checked exceptions, fully checked exceptions, and that's it. It's all about exception hierarchy